Yeah, so this is part of APS's School Gardens Conference. One more person, I'll let them in. Yeah, so last year it was supposed to be in person, so re-envisioning it this year. So thanks for grabbing your dirt so we can still play a little. My name's Tara Henderson and I'm at Explora. So I'm on the informal education side, supporting teachers in other ways. I'd like to start off with a round of introductions just so we can get to know each other. So your name, sort of the grade level you're currently teaching or age grade students you're working with, and then your first memory of like a garden or of plantings. As I said, I'm at Explora. I tend to work, I guess, across all ages, but if I'm in the classroom, I like the little guys just because they're excited about everything and they think I'm cool no matter what I do. So that's just my personal preference. My first memories in the garden really are following alongside or behind my father as he tilled our garden. And so as a little kid running in the dirt, that probably came up to at least my knees. I'm sure my brother and sister and I were completely filthy, but that was just sort of getting the garden ready to plant. And then of course, enjoying all the produce from it. I was the weird toddler that liked beets. That was one of my favorite foods. So yeah, so that's sort of my first memory of the garden. So who would like to share next?
I can go next. Can you guys hear me okay? The kids were saying I sounded garbled today during class, so is it okay? All right. So my name is Susan Chapoul, and I am the garden elective teacher and garden coordinator at Wilson Middle School. So the Wildcat Blooms Garden is kind of where I spend a lot of my time. And my experience with the garden began as a little kid. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and so I was either in the fields or in the garden all day, every day from the time I could walk. And I've always loved the garden, I've loved the fields, I've loved being able to work with the soil, with the land, and you know, it's just always been a part of me.
I'll go next. My name is Stephen. I work at the APS Sandia Mountain Natural History Center. It's an environmental education center. So every fifth grader in the district under normal times comes up for a hike. And we have about 7 miles of trails up here. And the whole point is to learn about the ecosystems, specifically the ecosystem of the Sandia Mountains. I grew up in suburban Southern California, so there was plenty of nice plantings and stuff around. My parents had a garden one year, and it was, I guess, a fairly nice sized garden. But I understand that my grandpa, who I didn't really know, was a big gardener, and so he grew everything. And I guess he was, like I said, I didn't really know him, and he was also a landscaper as well. So I think the tradition skipped really my mom and then landed on me. So I'm always outside with my friends, as my wife says, meaning my plants.
Priscilla or Amber?
Good afternoon. My name is Priscilla Garcia Franzoni, and I am a homeschooling mama. So I am homeschooling my son, and he's in 4th grade. And my first memory in my garden is with my abuelita, my grandmother. She would walk me around and show me the grapes and the tomatoes and all her herbs, and she was big on medicinal herbs. So at a very early age, I was introduced to beautiful plants. Thank you.
Amber? And of course, you may have students, so you're not able to chime in. Anthony, you want to introduce yourself?
There we go. All right. My name is Anthony Schmitz. Among other things, I'm a retired teacher. I taught middle school and high school for about 20 years. I've been retired for the last 5 years. I also managed farms and ranches and have gardened most of my life. I grew up in southern Mississippi, and we still work the fields with mules. I can remember all these big mules. They were big to me anyhow. And I still garden here in Albuquerque. I had a little farm with my daughter and son-in-law, and they now have it because I got sick and I couldn't work the farm anymore. And right now I have raised beds. And having some kind of technical difficulty here right now. But anyhow, I am hoping to work with the Los Padillas School in South Valley, where my daughter works. And then also I hope to be working with a project with Singing Arrow with refugee kids from Africa.
Very cool. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for sharing your gardening story, where it started. So while we are part of the garden conference, we're going to look at soil, and specifically, we're going to be talking and looking around science process skills, science and engineering practices. And so how can you use soil as a jumping off point for that? So part of our conversations, because I know some of you have students in person and students joining you on the computer screen, to have some of those conversations of how do you do this if you don't have everyone in the same space. And so that was part of the reason I asked everyone to gather at least a couple soil samples today. So hopefully everyone has a little bit of dirt in front of you. Promise not too much, too messy. Hopefully no one ruins their computer. I've had some close calls, but none yet. But yeah, so how do we use soil? Because we know that soil is usually an important part of growing. Of course, you can have aquaponics and hydroponics, but if you're setting up a home system or someone, like, you're probably going to grab soil of some sort rather than setting up a whole aquaponics or hydroponics system. So if you want to grab your soil, I've got a few different soils. I just put them in bags. So this is soil that I went and grabbed in my backyard. Also, I've got sand here because we just happen to have a lot of sand. I also have some potting soil because I often see people pulling up potting soil as one of their soils. Now, you may have other soils. You may have students with other soils. So if you've got access to a compost pile, a garden that's really, the soil's been amended, it's really rich, as opposed to other soil, it can be quite interesting. So we're just going to start off with feeling the soil. So I'm going to ask you to touch your soil, to get your hands a little bit dirty, and then either in the chat or by unmuting yourself, describe describe your soil. What do you notice? What are your senses telling you about your soil? Yeah, so when I'm looking and feeling my soil from my yard, I'm noticing that I've got some that's really, really fine. Some bigger pieces, got some sticks in mine. It's very, very dry right now.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was turning around when you said part of the directions. Did you want us to verbally describe it just at random?
Yeah, just at random, we're a small enough group. And then I'll be putting things in the chat too, because I know sometimes it's easier for people to type, but yes, if you can just describe at random.
Sure. So I was feeling two different soils. One was a soil from my house in the North Valley, and it felt very fine with a periodic larger piece and some vegetation. Couple unidentifiable things, just feeling it. And then I had a sample from up where I am in the Sandias right now. And it was at the bottom of a hill. They feel much more, they feel larger. The grains feel larger and more consistent. Couple pine needles, but also very dry.
I can talk about my soil a little bit. Mine, we were working in the garden today with a lot of different kinds of soil, so I just grabbed a quick sample from the garden. And this soil, because it was recently watered, it feels cool and kind of damp. It has a very rich smell to it. The particles are pretty small and you know, very organic smelling, I guess, is one thing I really noticed about it.
Priscilla or Anthony, what do you notice about your soils, your dirts?
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, well, I'm going to take a little bit different approach. And the soil, I was working out in my garden all day and working on drip irrigation systems and stuff. And the soil tells me that it's the source of our wealth. It tells me that if we take care of it, it will take care of us. And some of the new studies are showing that with practices like regenerative agriculture, that soil is going to be a big part of the solution to global climate change.
Priscilla, what do you notice about your soil?
Working out in my farm today, I was adding some amendments, some chicken manure to the soil. So aside from it being a little stinky, it's very clay-like. So whenever we wet the soil down, it just turned into heavy, heavy clay.
Priscilla, are you in the Albuquerque area or within, I don't know, 30 miles of it?
No, I live in Grant County. I live in
Okay, so you're
New Mexico.
okay. You're a lot further away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was just like thinking of like how everyone's describing their soil and thinking about where geographically we're all located, and what that might mean for our soil. One thing I've noticed in teaching at Explora is like in our summer camp programs, I always ask the students to bring in a bag of soil, just like I asked you all to gather a bag of soil today from around their home. And so most of these students are, if I'm teaching in Albuquerque, they're located somewhere near Albuquerque. And it's amazing the differences they start to notice in the soils. Just within, you think of not that big of a radius, as they bring them in and they start feeling them, they start touching them. And so starting to get that ownership of like, oh, my soil's like this, I wonder why this is, and then noticing different things. And Priscilla, I'm glad you mentioned something about getting your soil wet and what you noticed. And so that's where I'd like to take us next. So we're not going to dunk our soil in water yet, but just starting with some drops. So eyedroppers, pipettes are really great tools. If you have them, of course, a straw also works as well. And my to-go-to source currently for my pipettes is Amazon, because I can buy them pretty reasonably in bulk. And then you need some water as well. So you've got water nearby, your soil. And what I did with my soil is I went ahead and separated a little bit out into cups here. These are just 2-ounce portion cups. You can get them at a restaurant supply store. I like them because they're big enough, you can notice stuff, but then they're small enough, you're not using tons of material. And so I just separated mine out. Of course, might also use Petri dishes. If I have Petri dishes available, you could set little piles of soil up on a piece of wax paper, on a tray, on the sidewalk, on the back of a shovel, and you can get creative there. So once you have your soil and your water, I'd like you just to start by adding a few drops of water to your soil. Really paying attention, notice what's happening. You might want to feel it, you might want to smell it as well as you're doing that. Yeah, and then so for my soils, this one I've got dirt just from my backyard. I've got some sand. This is play sand. You'll find a lot in playgrounds, or you can buy a bag of it at Home Depot or Lowe's. Some potting soil here. And then I have some powdered clay. You don't normally find powdered clay as just one of the soils in your garden. But we'll use some of those characteristics maybe later. And what do you notice happening as you add your drops of water?
I was so used to the nature of my soil in the North Valley where it would beat up and run down if there's a slope and take a while to soak in, that it was surprised me when I did the drops in the soil that I got from up here in the Sandias, it immediately soaked right in. So I'm guessing the grain size had something to do with that because they're bigger grains. Also the nice smell of petrichor. That's the word, right? The smell of
Yeah,
newly fallen
so-
rain.
And I noticed with mine, like on the sand, it soaked in pretty quickly. My potting soil, it's still sitting on top. And then my powdered clay, it ran down to the side of the container. Maybe very, very slowly starting to soak in. Priscilla or Susan or Anthony. And then we have E128370. Have you all noticed?
When I added water to mine, the droplets pretty much absorbed right through the soil almost immediately. And now after adding several more, it looks like the soil is actually kind of caking together from the moisture. So it's kind of cool.
Priscilla, what have you noticed? Have you been able to test your soils?
What I noticed about my soil, since it's clay-like, when I wet the soil, I feel like it holds in the moisture, and it's very heavy, and it would make a really good mud pie.
Yeah, that could definitely be a direction to go, is adding more water and which ones stick together. And if you set them outside for a period of time, does that mud pie stay together? Yeah, so you might also try with your soil now that it's a little bit wet. See if you can get it to stick together. Will it make a ball? Does it just fall apart? And my potting soil still sticking on top.
My clay soil definitely stays together in a ball, and it even sticks on my hand.
And I've tried making a little mountain ridge with mine, seeing if I could pinch it up to a mountain ridge. And Susan, I see you have a little ball there.
Yeah, it's kind of, if I move it wrong, it'll fall apart, but it did create a little ball, so.
Elf Florist there, do you have any dirt that you're able to experiment with us with? So today we certainly don't have time to leave your soil out to dry, but if I had a group of students, it certainly would be something I might want to explore with them, is what happens to it over time. See what that tells you sort of about the soil and the soil qualities. Another interesting thing, thinking about the composition of the soil. So for this, you'll just need a clear container. I have a canning jar here. It certainly doesn't need to be this big. It can be smaller than this. Baby food jars, I've also used that. That works pretty well. Also been known to go and buy a bunch of like Gladware or Rubbermaid jars. When I'm giving this to students, I prefer that my jar seals up well. So that's usually my characteristic of, is it a jar that I want to use. So just go ahead and grab your clear container, your jar, and choose one of your soils. I've got mine maybe a third, halfway filled up with dirt. So choose one of your soils and add some dirt to it. And then once you get your soil in, you're just gonna go ahead and fill your jar most of the way up with water. Definitely have a lot of air bubbles in mine. And I'm gonna screw my lid on and go ahead and shake it all up, mix it all together, stir it up. Go ahead and let me know when you've got your mud smoothie all made. Oh, thanks, Stephen. I don't know if anyone can see mine in the video, but you could, I'm starting to notice some separation. I've got some floating stuff up at the top. And then some dirty looking water, very murky. And then it looks like I have layers here. I've got a number of different colors. And looking closely, the particle sizes also seem to change. Is anyone else seeing anything change in their jar?
Yes, same layering. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah. Susan, how is yours coming? Are you noticing anything in yours?
Well, I tell you now, first of all, I didn't have a jar, so I put it in a little plastic cup, and that was disastrous. So I'm cleaning up after that. But What I do have is from last year when they removed us from school for the pandemic, we had been doing something similar to that. And that is a jar that's been sitting in my room for over a year now, oil separating out. So I have that at least to show you.
Very cool. Yeah, so I mean, we're all getting some level of separation, but it's interesting that they all look slightly different. That could just be our videos, but it also may be something about the composition of the soil, that they're different. I'm pretty sure if I tried it with potting soil, I would get something different, or if I have sand as well. So that's, again, thinking of like if you've got students you're working with remotely, for students in the classroom, is everyone could still have some piece of dirt. And so really thinking about, can you compare and contrast amongst the different dirts that people have, and seeing what they notice. Let's see if I can. Share this. Yeah. So one of the things I want to think about as part of this, minimize some of these things, is thinking about science and engineering practices and thinking about science process skills and which ones can come into play. So we haven't gone very deep, we've just sort of gotten our fingers a little bit dirty. But what I'd like to spend some time on is thinking about using what we just did as a starting off point, delving into one of these practices. What would that look like if we took it further? So thinking students in person, students remote, what does that look like? What kind of questions would they come up with? What kind of questions would you support them with? And Susan, I'm sure you probably know all the NGSS standards very well. I'm going to let you all share which direction would you go using just the basis of soil as an exploration.
I would look at patterns just because of the layering, and then cause and effect. Why are the bigger ones at the bottom?
I would say it's definitely a model, helps us understand that soil is not purely one kind or another. I think I would, like in a jar, if I were using it, measure the layers and try to determine, what percent of the total is sand or silt or whatever the different types of soil might be.
So if we're thinking about the composition of soil and figuring that out and looking for cause and effect and patterns, what sort of things might you encourage students to do to come up with that rationale, those answers?
I would like for them to compare that phenomena to other things that they've experienced in their life. First thing that comes to mind is the Lego bin. So all the little Legos falling down to the bottom of the bin. Something like that, I'm sure you'd have to have available in as a visual, because they might notice it while they're playing Legos, but it may not be something that they could just pull up right on the spot. But I always like to have students make those connections to bring it into the realm of phenomena, because it's a recurring thing over and over again.
And I always think about like trail mix of what's at the top, what's at the bottom. What are you gonna find if you're looking for those little peanut pieces? I always seem to manage to sift down to the bottom in mine. The larger nuts stay up on top. But yeah, definitely making those connections to other things that are similar.
Scale could be a fun thing too, to imagine shrinking yourself down to a super small level, and imagining what it would be like to go through each, if you were something alive and you could go make your way through each of those layers, what would it be like? Like the things at the bottom, there's lots of room for you to climb through because there's spaces in between the grains, and as you get up higher, it's like clay, right? You have to dig through it, and there's no more room for you. And you can bring into illustrating that type of thing, and that could bring them down to that level as opposed to looking at it from their size. Just brings more dimensionality to understanding that phenomena.
There's a really fun activity that I did when I taught gardening at an elementary school. And we would get down to the ground and pretend that our thumb was going for a hike. And then we would give them maybe like a 12-inch string, and they would walk with their thumb for 12-inch, the 12-inch walk. And then we would share what we observed, but just the fact that we would get closer to the ground and observe everything around us, because sometimes we don't do that, So we had a whole other perspective of all the amazing little things growing in the ground, or the cool rocks that would appear, or the sticks and insects that we might not pay attention to as much when we're, standing up tall.
And I want to share this other thing. If I can find it. So this is a document that I use a lot when I'm working with early childhood educators. And I think thinking about 2, 3, 4-year-olds are like, oh no, we're not doing any science practices. We're not doing any engineering practices. But the reason I want to share this is because I think there's a lot of skills that are part of this when talking about science process skills that build into the science and engineering practices. And so Priscilla, as you were mentioning, observation and just really paying attention, I think that's a super important skill to have. Just being aware of the world around you. So I like this also because it crosses across so many disciplines, and thinking about how these connect together.
If I may share, when I worked with kindergarteners, we would go around the garden and point out the herbs, and we would take a moment to feel the herbs within our hands, you know, like in between our thumb and our pointer, and then we would rub our fingers so we could get the oil on our fingers, and then we would smell the aroma of the herbs. And I just remember all the children getting so excited about all the different smells and how each leaf had such a different feeling to it. And we would also sometimes start our day with closing our eyes and simply just listening for maybe a good 1 minute, and then sharing like what we heard, you know, like whether we heard a bird or the wind or somebody stepping on leaves. And yeah, I feel like that goes great with the observation piece.
Yeah, exactly.
I think all of that's important right now too, with the kids coming back to school. You know, we are seeing some of the things that that they are bringing with them. They just need that opportunity to kind of slow down and touch and feel and really become aware of the area around them and what's out there. So that whole idea of sensory perception and allowing them to just slow down a little bit and, you know, kind of center themselves. I think that's really important right now.
Right. Yeah, and I think that goes into like sort of the describing and the communicating. Like start seeing this when I'm working with early childhood educators, is just having that time to describe and communicate. And then if we jump over to the science and engineering practices, that communication is a huge piece. Like being able to communicate what you're seeing, what you're doing. Um, a 5-year-old, a fifth grader, a 15-year-old may communicate slightly differently and in different levels of detail, but still having that active communication piece. The one thing I like about this one that sometimes comes up when I'm talking about science and engineering practices is the idea of collaboration. And I think that's one thing I've definitely missed working with the students remotely, is like collaboration is much harder through a computer screen than it is in person, and thinking of like those side conversations that happen, and how do you foster that? And sometimes that naturally comes about, but that collaboration piece is a huge part of science. It's a huge part of math. It's a huge part of engineering. Having other people you can talk to, you can share with. So just stop that. So thinking of science and engineering practices and your soil, one of the things I want to jump into now is sort of that idea of investigation. So coming up with a question, testing it out. So, you know, we did our soil jars, not really a in-depth investigation, but maybe something to get kids thinking about, like, oh, these soils are all different. They're not all the same. Maybe I can take this further. What are some ideas that you have of what are some questions that might come up that could lead into an investigation, and what would that look like? We had a mud pie earlier, but where could that go, and how could that relate to the garden?
what kind of layer would the plants like to grow in most? What layer holds the water better?
Might want to look at what type of plants grow best in different types of soil.
Right, and you could do some research, but you could also test it out yourself. Priscilla, what ideas do you have? Or Flora said, I think is just listening in today.
Perhaps observing like shady spots and sunny spots, and paying attention to what holds the moisture best, and even adding, different types of mulch, whether that be, some leaves from the fall or some straw, and just observing.
Could we separate the layers? What would happen if we separate them?
And I'm thinking about watering and mulching, and like, how often do I need to water? And how moist does my soil need to be? We had some newly planted trees at Explora that we wanted to make sure didn't die and got enough water, to the point where they were overwatered and then died. And so that's always a good learning experience of like, when is too much water? And so we developing an investigation around that, of like the moisture in the soil and how much water you need for something to grow. One of the schools I visited a number of years ago, they'd set up some growing science experiments, and they were testing to see what their plants liked to drink. This one student was testing with water, Coke, and Diet Coke, and seeing which plant was growing better depending on what they were receiving. Interesting enough, I think it was the Diet Coke plant that was at that point in time a little bit taller than the other ones. So I don't know if it's a thing, but it was certainly something that stuck with me over the years of like, maybe it's not just water. Should we all be pouring Diet Coke on our fields? Probably not. But it's certainly one of those, let's ask a question, let's get that questioning started as part of that.
We do something similar to that with narcissus bulbs right before Christmas, and we have the kids put water on one, and the other one they can use whatever they want. And yeah, we get some pretty crazy results and some very smelly results. And it's always fun for them though. They have a really good time with that, trying to figure out what might be better for the plants than water.
One of our experiments, we planted chiles and tomatoes in trays, and then we put, the plastic dome over it. And a couple of days later, there were these mushrooms growing. So then, we recognize that, okay, maybe there's too much moisture in the soil if these mushrooms are thriving. So that was a cool observation to see.
Something like that happened my very first year teaching. I made up this little greenhouse design to make out of straws, like a little pyramid shape straws, and then put saran wrap or a plastic bag or something over it. Had our seeds in there, and then they just get all moldy because the water just never had a chance to evaporate, and it just same thing. I mean, fungus took over.
And then, so as I'm sitting here listening to you all talk and like going through the different practices, and I'm hearing like you're analyzing and interpreting your data. You're constructing an explanation as to maybe it's got too much water. Certainly obtaining and evaluating and communicating information. And so even if it's not like taking it like just in how you're talking, like hitting on all of those different science practices, engineering practices, and thinking about how do you draw those out in kids? How do you get them to take it deeper? So thinking of those experiences that have stuck with you, how would you get a student to take it deeper and to see, does that smelly concoction for the narcissus bulb really work? What's going on there?
I like what's in the chat too about the temperatures of the soil and how that helps plants grow. We've been looking at seed packages and, don't plant until the soil temperature is at such and such degrees. And that's really been interesting for the students. I think they never really think about soil temperature and how that might affect plant growth until we specifically looked at the seed packages. And so that's a good investigation for students as well.
Yeah. So
Could be a cool experiment.
How might you set up sort of an experiment around that? Is there a way you could heat the soil to different temperatures, or is it just one of those natural plant at different times?
I guess when I think about it, if I was going to do it inside, like we have some grow lights for our hydroponics, so that might help it. If we're looking to warm the soil, or a heating pad underneath it, maybe putting plants in a fridge, so two definite different temperatures, and then one just in room temperature, and seeing how they grow. I don't know, that's just quick off the top of my head, but that's what I might consider doing. I think maybe also letting them plant some seeds that are supposed to wait until the soil's a little warmer, while it's still cool, and see what happens. Does it work or doesn't it? We just look at the garden as a big experiment, I guess, and some things work and some things don't, and there's always something to talk about.
Stephen, are you doing any gardening stuff, or just is it more soil based?
With students, it's really neither. I mean, we're doing a virtual program now, so I can go outside as long as I have enough high speed left on my phone. It's right now, it's mostly like animal evidence and stuff like that. However, I did do for a little while, there was a stint of schools where the kids could go outside a lot. So it kind of depends where you are in Albuquerque, what kids are allowed to go outside for a little bit and what kids have to stay inside. But we would do a little clay content test. Just kind of like what we did with the soil, about making a ball and making a snake. But that was about it, because we have to cover all the parts of an ecosystem. So soil just being that one part.
Yeah, so a couple other things that I wasn't going to have everyone gather all of these materials, but thinking about sort of soil and the connections to agriculture and farming in our community is thinking about the role of acequias and how water runs through the acequias and what happens if your acequias are dirty and filled with grass or leaves, or what happens if they're lined with concrete, and what could be benefits to both of them. Had students make mini models using the dollar store or something, get the large foil trays and set them up outside with a bunch of dirt and let them sort of create their own pathways. We've been able to do that at our farm camps that we run at the Agri Nature Center. And so the students are able to walk around the property, they see the acequias at work, and then they're creating their own model systems of that. And it's something that most people don't think about acequias as a way of watering. But it has been part of sort of the culture and community of New Mexico. And so making that connection between the soil, and the agriculture and the gardens that way. Yeah, so I wasn't going to have you gather enough dirt and everything else to make your own systems today. The other thing that I'd like to do sort of is exploring soil and thinking about the role that soil plays is soil as a filter. So thinking about water filtration, and then the different types of soil and how it filters water. I like to use grape Kool-Aid as my dirty water source, because when it filters well, it changes from this dark grape Kool-Aid color to like a pink color. And so it's very, very clear and distinct that there's been some change there. And you can easily tell if your filter is working or not working. And so thinking about how soil even like is used for that, whether or not we're actively using our soil, but every time if you're watering in your garden, that water eventually is going to soak into the aquifer. And so what other roles does soil play in our environment, in our ecosystem? Yeah. So I wasn't expecting everyone else to go out and gather water filtration systems and get grape Kool-Aid and stuff like that. But I want to share those as just two ways that I've found, or I guess I've used when working with students and thinking about soil and the connections to our environment. Yeah, so, you guys have been great about pulling out the different science practices and engineering practices. And I think that's an important part, is sometimes we get lost in the planting of the garden, that we forget about all these other learning opportunities, just even posing and asking questions as part of that. And I think mostly we looked at the science practices today, but you could certainly get into engineering systems to take care of your plants, keep them healthy or not, as part of that. So that's about all I had planned today. We're small groups, so we certainly went through things a little bit faster. But just thank you all for getting your fingers dirty.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Tara, I know you guys have a lot of things at the museum there.